The wind in 1882 Montana was not just wind. It was a knife, a razor, and a voice. It came down from the northern peaks with a sound like a sharpening stone, carrying a white darkness that swallowed the world. Winter had gripped the high plains for months, but this storm was different. This was a blizzard that meant to kill, a howling, smothering force that erased the lines between earth and sky. Luke Callahan felt it in his bones, a deep, aching cold that his wool coat and canvas jacket could not stop. He was a man in his 30s, but some days this land made him feel ancient. He rode his horse, Bess, through a world that had no landmarks, only the vertical, stinging rush of snow. He kept his head down, the ice crackling in his beard with every breath. He was a solitary man by nature and by choice. His ranch was a small, stubborn patch of defiance carved into the foothills, miles from the nearest neighbor and even further from the judgments of Bozeman. He liked the quiet, but today, the quiet was buried under the scream of the storm. He had spent the last 4 hours fighting his way to a small coulee where his cattle herd was meant to be sheltering. He found them, or what was left of them, huddled, backs to the wind, coated in ice, their breathing visible as faint, desperate puffs. He'd found 3 calves frozen solid, standing as if they were just waiting, and a yearling drifted over completely. There was nothing to be done but check the windbreak, scatter what feed he'd hauled on the mule, and turn for home. A cold knot of failure in his stomach. This land always took its share. Now, he was riding on instinct alone, trusting the horse to find the faint line of the creek that would lead them back to the cabin. The light was failing, turning the white world into a deep, bruising purple. He was tired. His hands, even in thick mittens, were numb stumps. He was thinking of the fire, of coffee boiled thick and black, of the 4 walls that kept the white hell at bay. That was when Bess stopped. She tossed her head, snorting, her ears flat back against the wind. "What is it, girl?" Luke grunted, pulling his scarf down from his mouth. "It's nothing. It's just more snow." But she refused to move, sidestepping, her eyes wide. Luke squinted into the driving snow. There was nothing, and then a shape, a darkness that did not belong. He slid off the horse, his legs stiff, the snow grabbing him past his knees. He waded forward, his hand on the revolver at his hip, though he could not imagine what man or animal would be out here. It was a carriage, or what was left of one. A fine, dark blue carriage, the kind you saw in town, not on a rancher's track. It was splintered, tilted on its side like a dead beetle. One wheel shattered. A trunk had been thrown clear, its lid broken open, spilling frozen silks and linens that fluttered like captured birds in the snow. Near the wreckage, half buried, was the stiff, dark shape of a horse, its legs pointing at the sky. He saw the trail then, faint and almost gone. Drag marks. Someone had crawled from the wreck. Luke followed the marks for 20 yards, his heart hammering a slow, cold beat. He found her coiled in a drift, a small mound of darkness against the white. She was half buried, face down. He grabbed her shoulder, rolling her over, and his breath caught. She was young. Her face was a waxy, bluish white, her lips cracked and pale. Ice matted her dark eyelashes to her cheeks. She was dressed in fine, dark wool, a coat that was fashionable but useless in this wilderness. It was torn open, and he could see the delicate lace of a blouse beneath. He fumbled for a pulse at her neck, his own fingers too numb to feel. He pulled off his mitten and pressed his bare, rough fingers against her skin. It was like touching marble. He cursed, low and steady. He felt again, pressing harder. A flutter, a faint, impossible bird's wing beating against his thumb. Once, then again. There was no thought. There was only the animal instinct of survival. He ripped off his own heavy coat, the wind hitting his chest like a fist, and wrapped it around her. She weighed almost nothing. He lifted her slight body. his arms straining not from the weight, but from the awkwardness of the snow and the stiffness of her frozen limbs. Getting her onto Bess was a nightmare. The horse spooked at the dead weight, the unfamiliar smell. Luke spoke to the mare in a low, harsh rumble, the only voice of command he had left. "Easy, girl, easy. We gotta go, now." He finally heaved the woman up, slinging her sideways over the saddle like a sack of feed. He climbed up behind her, his body aching with the cold. He pulled her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her to hold her in place, pressing his body against hers to give what little warmth he had left. The ride back to the cabin was the longest mile of his life. He was exposed, his shirt and jacket no match for the storm's teeth. He could feel the woman's cold seeping into him, a dead cold that frightened him more than the wind. He bowed his head over hers, his chin resting on her icy hair, and prayed not to God, but to the small, stubborn cabin he hoped was still standing. The dark shape of the cabin rose from the snow like a miracle. He fell from the horse, pulling the woman with him, and half dragged, half carried her to the door. He kicked it open, and the wind screamed past them into the small, dark room. He slammed the door shut, plunging them into a sudden, muffled silence. For a moment, he just leaned against the wood, breathing in the smell of pine smoke and cold ash. Then he moved. He laid her on the bearskin rug before the hearth. His hands were shaking, clumsy. Fire, that was first. He stacked kindling, his movements desperate, striking the match with a thumb that barely bent. The flame caught greedy, and he added larger pieces of pine, welcoming the sharp crackle and the first wave of heat. He turned back to her. She hadn't moved. Her breathing was shallow, almost invisible. He knew about frostbite. He knew what it did. He lit the oil lamp, the yellow light pushing back the shadows, and looked at her properly. Her fingers were waxy and white. Her boots, fine leather things with small buttons, were frozen solid. He took his knife and cut them away, wincing as the leather parted. Her stockings were silk. He cut them away, too. Her feet were the same bluish-white as her hands. He had to get her wet clothes off. He hesitated, his scarred hands hovering over the delicate buttons of her torn coat. It felt wrong, a violation, but the cold would kill her if he did not. He worked quickly, his face grim, cutting the laces of her corset, pulling the layers of frozen wool and damp silk away from her skin. He saw the fine, pale skin of her ribs, the hollow of her throat. She was so thin, underneath it all. She was dressed in undergarments finer than anything he had ever seen. He averted his eyes, wrapping her in the 3 heavy wool blankets he owned, piling them on top of her. He went to his small cupboard, took down the bottle of whiskey he kept for medicine, and knelt beside her. He lifted her head, forcing a few drops between her pale, cracked lips. She coughed, a dry, rattling sound, but she swallowed. "That's it," he muttered, to himself more than to her. "You fight now. You hear me? You fight." He filled a basin with snow and brought it inside, letting it melt near the fire. He took her hands, waxy and lifeless, and began to rub them gently with the snow, then with his own rough, warm hands, trying to bring the life back into them without breaking the skin. He did the same for her feet. It was slow, agonizing work. Hours passed. The storm howled, rattling the single-glass window, but inside, the fire roared, and the cabin grew warm. Luke sat back on his heels, exhausted, watching her. The color was returning to her face, no longer blue, but still a stark, pale white. The firelight caught the planes of her face, her high cheekbones, the soft curve of her mouth. She was from somewhere else, somewhere soft. This country would eat her alive. He made coffee, the smell filling the small room. He sat in his one chair, sipping the scalding liquid, and watched her. He was a man used to silence, but this silence was different. It was heavy, waiting. Near dusk, her eyelids fluttered. She woke with a gasp, a short, terrified intake of breath. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, flew open and fixed on him. She tried to sit up, tangling in the blankets, a look of pure, animal panic on her face. "Easy now," Luke said, his voice rough from the cold and disuse. He held up his hands, palms open. "Easy. You're safe." "Where?" Her voice was a dry whisper. She shrank back, pulling the blankets up to her chin, her eyes darting around the rough-hewn cabin. "Who are you? What happened?" "Name's Luke Callahan. This is my cabin." He kept his voice low, steady. "I found you in the snow, near a broken carriage. You were near frozen." She stared at him, her breathing coming fast. He was a large man, made larger by his winter clothes, his beard untrimmed, the firelight catching the old white scars that crossed the back of his hands and disappeared up his sleeve. Her gaze flickered from his hands to the heavy rifle resting on pegs above the door. My carriage," she whispered, her brow furrowing in confusion, then clearing in sudden, sharp terror. "The men, were there men?" Luke shook his head. "Just you, and a dead horse. The storm's covered everything else by now." He stood slowly, so as not to spook her, and ladled some broth from the pot he'd hung over the fire. He'd made it from dried jerky and cornmeal, but it was hot. He held the tin cup out to her. She stared at it, then at him. I cannot pay you." The words hung in the air, a strange, formal declaration. It made Luke's shoulders tighten. "Ain't asking for pay," he said, gruffer than he intended. "It's broth. Drink it. You need the warmth." She took the cup, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold it. Her fingers, he saw, were turning a painful, mottled red and purple. The thaw was beginning. She winced, tears welling in her eyes, but she drank, cradling the cup as if it were an anchor. "What's your name, miss?" he asked, turning back to the fire, giving her the decency of not being watched. There was a long silence, filled only by the wind. "Anna," she said finally, her voice small. "My name is Anna." Luke knew a lie when he heard one. It was too hesitant, too quick. He didn't push. A person had a right to their secrets, especially out here. He'd left his own name buried back east. "Well, Anna," he said, sitting back down, "you're safe here. The storm set in. No one's getting in or out of this valley for days." A new kind of fear crossed her face. Trapped. He saw her mind working, calculating. She was trapped here. With him. A stranger. The tension in the cabin grew as thick as the frost on the window pane. It was the tension of two worlds colliding. Her, with her soft voice and the remnants of fine clothes. And him, with his scarred hands and his silence. They were separated by a gulf of class, of experience, of mystery. But the storm made the cabin shrink, pushing them together, forcing an intimacy neither of them wanted. She watched him. He could feel her gaze on his back as he mended a piece of harness. She watched how he moved, the efficiency of his hands, the way he seemed to take up all the air in the small room. He was aware of her, too, the faint scent of her, something like lavender, that clung to her despite the ordeal, the quiet way she breathed. The cabin had been his alone for so long, and her presence in it was a loud, unsettling thing. Night fell, absolute and smothering. The blizzard reached its full fury, the wind hitting the cabin like a physical blow. "You take the bunk," Luke said, pointing to the simple cot built into the wall, piled with his blankets. "No, I couldn't. That is your bed. I will sit by the fire." She tried to sound firm, but her voice wavered. "Don't be a fool," he said, not unkindly. "You're sick. You need the rest. I'll take the floor." He didn't wait for an argument. He threw down his bedroll near the door, a position of habit, closer to his rifle. He checked the fire, banking it for the night, and blew out the lamp. The room was plunged into darkness, lit only by the red, pulsing glow of the embers. For a long time, there was only the roar of the wind. Luke lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening. He heard her settle, the rustle of the blankets. He thought he heard a sound like a choked-off sob, but the storm swallowed it. He must have drifted off. He woke hours later, the fire low, the cabin cold. It was her voice that woke him. She was murmuring, caught in a fever dream. The words were tangled, thick with fear. "No, please, not his. It's not yours." Luke sat up quietly, his hand moving to his knife before he remembered where he was. He listened. "Langley," she whimpered, the name clear. "Father, they took it. They took everything." Her voice rose, sharp with panic. "The ranch! It's all gone! Father's ranch!" She thrashed, the blankets falling away. Luke crossed the small room in 2 strides. She was shivering violently, her face pale and slick with sweat. He put his hand on her shoulder. "Anna," he said, keeping his voice low and firm. "You're dreaming. Wake up." She cried out, her eyes flying open, but they were blind, seeing only the nightmare. She scrambled away from him, hitting her back against the cold logs of the cabin wall. "No, don't touch me. Get away." "It's me, Callahan, Luke Callahan." He spoke the name like a rope. "You're in my cabin. You're safe. It's just the storm." Her breath was coming in ragged, painful sobs. The terror in her eyes was real. It was not just from the cold. It was from what she'd been running from. He sat on the edge of the cot, keeping his distance. "You're safe here," he repeated, his voice the only steady thing in the howling night. "It's just the wind." She was trembling, a deep, bone-rattling shake that was part cold, part shock. She stared at him, her eyes slowly focusing, recognizing him. The terror faded, replaced by a profound, desolate weariness. She was still so cold. She leaned forward, her body seeming to fold in on itself. He thought she was going to fall. Without thinking, he reached out, putting one arm around her shoulders to steady her. She didn't pull away. She was rigid for a moment. And then, with a sigh that sounded like something breaking, she slumped against him. Her head rested on his chest. He could feel the fine, damp hair through his shirt, the smallness of her bones. She was lighter than a child, and she was shaking. He was stiff, unused to holding another person, but he didn't move. He just held her steady, his hand resting on her back, his other arm braced on the cot. She wasn't a lady of refinement now. She was just a survivor, and so was he. Her breathing slowly deepened, the ragged sobs quieting, the shaking eased. She drifted back into an exhausted sleep, her head still resting against him. Luke Callahan sat in the dark, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He held the stranger, this woman who lied about her name and dreamed of a place called Langley. He felt the light, warm weight of her, a dangerous, fragile thing that had washed up in his isolated world. Outside, the snow beat against the window, a relentless white fist. But inside the cabin, there was the fire and the steady sound of 2 people breathing, 2 strangers held together by the simple, brutal need for warmth. The blizzard did not break for 3 days. It was a lifetime. The world shrank to the 4 log walls of the cabin, a tiny, warm bubble of survival floating in a sea of roaring white. The sound of the wind was constant, a high, mournful scream that vibrated in the wood, in their chests. When Luke woke that first morning, she was already awake. She was sitting up on the cot, the pile of blankets clutched to her chin, watching him, her eyes, no longer wide with fever or the memory of nightmares, were clear and sharp. They were the color of deep water under ice. There was an aching awkwardness in the air. He was a man who had not shared his space with another living soul in years, save his horse. And she was a woman who had woken up in a stranger's bed, in a stranger's clothes. He had found an old, clean wool shirt for her, after being held by him in the night. "Morning," he grunted, his voice thick. He rose from his bedroll, his body stiff, and went straight to the hearth. He stirred the embers, adding kindling. The routine was his anchor. "Good morning," she replied. Her voice was different, not the dry whisper of yesterday. It was low, but it carried, each word spoken with a clean, careful precision that did not belong in a Montana foothills cabin. It was the voice of parlors and East Coast schools. "Coffee's near gone, but it's hot," he said, not looking at her. He busied himself with the pot and a slab of salt pork, slicing it thin with his belt knife. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." He stopped, the knife halfway through the pork. He looked over his shoulder. "Just Luke. Mr. is for men in town." A faint flush rose on her cheeks. "Then, thank you. Luke, I did not properly introduce myself. My name is Victoria." Victoria. It suited her. It was a name like her voice. Tall and straight. It was also, he sensed, not the whole story. Anna had been a panicked lie. Victoria felt like a planned one, a shield. He nodded, accepting it. "Victoria, get you some food. You'll need it." They ate in a strained silence, separated by the small, rough-hewn table. The meal was salt pork, fried crisp, and 2 hard biscuits apiece from his tin, softened with bacon grease. He watched her eat. She held the tin fork as if it were silver, her movements small and deliberate, and he saw her hands again, properly, in the gray daylight filtering through the one, snow-caked window. They were fine-boned, the nails clean and shaped. The frostbite had turned the tips of her fingers a painful, deep purple, and the skin was blistered, but there was no mistaking them. They were the hands of a lady, hands that had never hauled water, split wood, or scrubbed a floor. They were hands that played the piano, maybe, or held porcelain cups. He looked down at his own, broad, scarred, the knuckles thick, the lines etched with dirt and old wounds. He curled them into a fist and looked away. Where are we, exactly?" she asked, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. "About 40 miles north of Bozeman, in the foothills of the Bridgers." 40 miles? Her face went pale. "So far." "As the crow flies," he clarified. "By the trails. With the snow this deep, it's nearer 70, and the pass will be closed. Nothing's moving." Her hands tightened on the tin cup of coffee he'd given her. How long will the storm last?" "This one?" He listened to the wind, a creature trying to claw its way in. "Could be today, could be 2 more days. And when it stops, it'll be another 3 before I can even think of digging out a trail." She processed this, her expression tightening. She was trapped, with him. The first day passed in silence and routine. He went out to check on Bess and the mule. A short, brutal journey to the lean-to shed. He came back caked in ice, the cold clinging to him like a shroud. She had added wood to the fire, moving stiffly, her body aching from the cold and the ordeal. On the second day, the wind quieted its scream to a low, steady moan. The air in the cabin felt heavier, the confinement more absolute. They had to talk. It was either that or go mad. "You're a long way from home," he said. Not a question, just a fact. He was oiling his rifle, the methodical scrape of the cloth a rhythm in the quiet. She was sitting on the cot, mending the tear in her fine wool skirt with the needle and thread he'd given her. Her stitches were tiny, perfect. "I was traveling to Bozeman," she said, her eyes on her work. "Alone?" She hesitated. "No, I had companions, a driver and a guard." "What happened to them?" Her hands stilled. A single drop of water, a melted snowflake from the roof, dripped onto the hot stove with a sharp hiss. "We were ambushed," she said, her voice barely audible. "On the pass, before the storm hit full. It was so fast. They just started shooting." Luke stopped wiping the rifle. He looked at her. Her face was bloodless. "Armed men." She nodded, a small, jerky movement. "3 of them. They shot Mr. Griggs, the driver, first, then Silas. He fired back. The carriage. It went off the road. I ran into the snow. I thought they were right behind me." She was shaking. "I thought I would die out there." "They might have," Luke said, his voice flat. "The storm didn't care who it took. You ran. You survived. That's all that matters." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. You speak as if you know." Luke's gaze went to the fire. No. He knew everything about running. He knew about the moment after the gunfire, when the world goes silent and you have to choose. He didn't mean to remember, but the close air, the smell of gunpowder from his rifle oil, it brought it back. It wasn't a blizzard, but a choking, sun-baked street in Kansas. 10 years ago, he'd been younger, faster, and dumber. He was working as a hired gun for a cattle outfit, a job he hated but was good at. His only friend was a man named Silas, a cheerful, unlucky card player. The memory was sharp. Silas, backing out of the saloon, his face pale. 3 men following him. One of them, a rancher's son named Kobe, was red-faced with whiskey and rage, accusing Silas of cheating. Luke had been leaning against a post, watching. He knew Silas hadn't cheated. He just got lucky for once. "You give that money back, or I'll take it from your hide." Kobe had snarled, his hand on his gun. "Now, Kobe, it was a fair game," Silas said, his hands up, trying to soothe him. "Thief!" Kobe yelled, and he drew. Luke was moving before the thought formed. His draw was a blur, a reflex honed by a life he hadn't wanted. He fired once. Kobe's 2 friends went for their own guns, but Luke's was already steady. "Don't," he'd said, his voice cold as a river stone. Kobe was on the ground, his eyes wide with surprise, a dark stain spreading on his shirt. He was dead. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas had grabbed his arm. "Luke, you gotta ride. That was Jedediah Stone's boy, his youngest boy. Stone won't wait for a trial. He'll send 20 men after you by sundown." "It was defense," Luke had said, his own voice sounding distant. "It don't matter." Silas had shoved him toward his horse. "It was his boy. Go north. Don't stop." Luke rode. He rode north for 1,000 miles. The guilt a cold, hard lump in his gut. It wasn't the guilt of the killing. It was a clean shot, a man's life or his friend's. It was the guilt of what it had cost. He'd lost his name, his past, his one friend. He'd become a ghost, a drifter, until he found this valley, this patch of isolation where Jedediah Stone's long arm couldn't reach, and where he could live out his penance in silence. "Luke?" Victoria's voice pulled him back. He blinked, the dusty street vanishing, replaced by the fire-lit cabin. He looked at her, his eyes hard. "I know about running," he said. He went back to cleaning his rifle. The small confession seemed to break a dam. That evening, over a meal of beans and cornbread, she talked more. "My father died," she said, staring into her tin plate. 2 months ago, he left me his ranch." Luke's head came up. A woman inheriting a ranch was not unheard of, but it was rare and dangerous. "It fell into chaos," she continued, picking her words with care. "My father, he had a foreman, a man named Morgan. He believes the ranch should be his, that my father promised it to him. When I arrived to take control, he and his men, they were not welcoming." "So you were running from them too," Luke stated. "I was trying to get to Bozeman, to see the territorial marshal, to file the papers properly." She looked at him, her gaze desperate. "I have to get there. These men, They won't stop. They killed my father's most loyal man. I know they did. They want the land. She still hadn't said the name. Langley. He remembered from her fever dream. He knew the name. Everyone in Montana knew the Langley Ranch. It was the largest in the territory, a sprawling empire of grass and cattle that controlled half the valley. If she was that Langley. He pushed the thought away. It was impossible. She was just a woman named Victoria, running from a foreman named Morgan. That was enough. On the third morning, they woke to silence, a bright, profound, and heavy silence. The wind had stopped. Luke opened the door, and they were met with a wall of white. The snow was drifted to the eaves. The world outside transformed into a smooth, sculpted landscape of blinding white and blue shadows. The sun was so bright on the snow it hurt to look at. "It's beautiful," Victoria whispered, standing behind him in the doorway. "It's deadly," Luke replied. The air was frigid. Still, he could hear the crack of frozen trees in the quiet. And then he heard something else. A high, thin cry. A harmony of howls. Victoria tensed. "What is that?" "Wolves," Luke said, his face hardening. He shut the door. "The storm starves them out, makes them bold. They smell the mule." The howling grew closer as the day wore on. A pack. They were circling, testing. Luke checked his rifle again, filled his pockets with cartridges. He strapped his knife to his belt and pulled on his heavy coat. As dusk fell, the blue twilight was filled with their calls. Closer now. Just beyond the shed, he heard the mule bray, a sound of pure terror. "Stay inside," Luke ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Bar the door. Don't open it for any reason, not unless you hear my voice." Her face was white, her eyes huge. "You cannot go out there. There are too many. I lose that mule. I lose my way out of here. I lose Bess. I lose everything." He didn't look at her as he said it. He slung the rifle over his shoulder. "Bar it." He stepped out into the blue-white world. Victoria rushed to the window, rubbing a clear patch on the frost. She watched him wade through the chest-deep snow. His powerful shoulders set, the rifle held ready. He was a dark shape against the blinding landscape. He disappeared around the corner of the cabin toward the shed. She waited. The silence was worse than the howling. She heard the mule scream. Then the night exploded. The crack of the rifle was deafening, echoing off the snow-covered hills. Once, a pause, filled with a chorus of terrible snarls and growls. The crack again, then a different sound, a heavy, guttural roar, followed by a human grunt of effort. "Luke!" she screamed, her hands flat against the frozen glass. She could see nothing, only the impassive snow. She heard a thud against the shed wall, more snarling, a choked-off yelp, then silence, a silence that stretched for 1 minute, then 2. She was trembling, her mind racing. He was dead. They had him. She should run, but where? She looked at the door, at the heavy wooden bar. A heavy fumbling knock. She froze. "Luke," she whispered. "Victoria." His voice was a strained gasp. "Open the door." Her hands shook so badly she could barely lift the bar. She hauled it back and pulled the door open. He fell inside, collapsing to his knees, snow and blood covering his front. He pushed the door shut with his back and dropped the bar into place. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps. "Luke, you're hurt!" "It's nothing," he panted, leaning against the wall. But his left arm hung uselessly, his sleeve torn open, blood welling dark and thick from a gash on his forearm. "That is not nothing," she cried, her panic giving way to a fierce, cold anger. "Sit by the fire, now!" To her surprise, he obeyed. He stumbled to the stool, slumping over, his head down. The rifle clattered to the floor. She moved, her body finally obeying her. She lit the lamp, her hands quick. She grabbed the basin, filling it with water from the bucket, and tore a strip from her own clean petticoat. She grabbed the whiskey. She knelt before him, pushing back the torn, bloody sleeve. It was not a bullet, it was a bite. 2 deep punctures and a long, ragged tear where the wolf's fangs had ripped through flesh. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice shaking but firm. She poured the whiskey straight into the wound. Luke hissed, his whole body going rigid. A low groan forced from his chest, but he did not move. She cleaned it, her delicate, uncalloused hands working with a strange, precise efficiency. He watched her face, pale and taut in the firelight, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Got one," he muttered, his voice strained. "Big male. The others ran off. The mule. Mule's fine." "Be quiet," she ordered. She found his sewing kit, the one he used for mending harness, and threaded the heavy needle. "This will hurt." "Get on with it," he breathed. She stitched the wound. Her hands did not tremble. She pulled the skin together, her movements deft and sure, as if she had done this 100 times. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw standing out. But he watched her. He watched the way her dark eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, the way she bit her lower lip. When she was done, she tied off the thread and wrapped the clean bandage tightly around his arm. Her work was finished. She should have pulled away. But her hands lingered, one resting on his wounded forearm, the other on his bicep. She was still kneeling, looking at the bandage. He was looking at the top of her head. Slowly, his good hand, the right one, came up. The scarred, calloused fingers gently covered her own, the ones resting on his arm. Their eyes met. The cabin was silent save for the crackle of the fire. The air between them was so thick he could taste it. It was gratitude, and fear, and something else. A raw, dangerous warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. He saw the woman, proud and terrified, who had stitched a man's arm by firelight. She saw the man, brutal and kind, who had fought wolves for a mule and who had held her while she dreamed. He was a rough man, a killer, a ghost. She was a lady, an heiress, hunted. He had no right to even look at her. He would ruin her. She was a woman who needed to be in Bozeman, who needed the law. He was the opposite of the law. Needing him was a weakness she could not afford. He pulled his hand away, breaking the contact. She snatched hers back as if burned. "It'll heal," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Later, the tension settled back in, but it was changed. It was no longer the tension of strangers. It was the tension of awareness. He sat in his chair, his wounded arm resting on his leg. She sat on the cot, her hands clasped in her lap. "Luke," she said, her voice soft in the quiet. He turned his head. "You saved my life. When you found me. And you saved it again tonight." He looked at the fire, at the red heart of the coals. He thought of the dead man in Kansas, of the long years of running. He thought of this woman, who brought the world he'd fled crashing back into his cabin. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "Survival ain't a debt." She didn't answer. He glanced at her. She was watching him, her face full of a complicated emotion he could not name. Her eyes said she knew he was wrong. Her eyes said she owed him everything. That night, she insisted he take the cot, his arm being injured. He argued, but he was weak from blood loss and the fight. He relented, falling onto the bunk, while she took his bedroll near the fire. He drifted into a painful, restless sleep. Hours later, he woke. The fire was low. His arm throbbed. He turned his head and saw her. She was not in the bedroll. She was standing at the window, staring out. The storm was gone, and a full moon had risen, turning the endless snow-covered wilderness into a landscape of silver and blue. It was vast, beautiful, and utterly inhuman. It was the place that had tried to kill her, the place that held the wolves. But as he watched her silhouette, he saw the set of her shoulders. The fear was gone. She was not looking at an enemy. She was just looking, and he knew, with a sudden certainty, what she was thinking. She was safer here, in this tiny cabin, in this brutal landscape, with a scarred man she barely knew than she had ever been in her father's fine house, surrounded by the men who wanted her inheritance. Here, the dangers were honest. They had teeth, and they howled, but they did not lie. She turned her head, feeling his gaze. Their eyes met across the dark, quiet room. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she turned back to the window and the silver light of the moon. The world was born new, smothered in white, when the wind finally stopped. The silence was so heavy it felt like a weight, pressing down from a sky that was a sharp, aching blue. The stillness was louder than the storm had been. Luke felt it in his arm first. The throbbing had settled into a stiff, deep ache. He opened his eyes and found Victoria watching him, not from the window, but from the chair. She had not slept. Her eyes were shadowed, but the panic was gone, replaced by a quiet, assessing gaze. "It stopped," she said. "Aye." He sat up, grunting as the torn muscles in his arm protested. The movement was a fresh pain. She was at his side in an instant, not with the hesitant fear of the first day, but with the purpose she'd found last night. "You've bled through again." She had his bandage material ready, the water basin clean. "It'll keep," he said, pushing himself to his feet. "I gotta dig us out. Check the stock." "You will sit," she commanded, and there was a note of steel in her voice that surprised him. "I will clean it. Then you may dig." He sat. He let her tend to him. Her hands were still soft, but they were steady now. The blisters from the frostbite were raw, but she did not flinch as she worked. Her touch surprisingly gentle, her stitching efficient. He watched her, the way her dark hair fell forward, the line of her jaw set in concentration. She was a different woman than the one he had pulled from the snow. This one had a spine. When she was done, he nodded his thanks, pulled on his coat, and grabbed the shovel. The door was the first battle. He had to dig his way out. The snow drifted higher than his head. It was heavy, wet snow, and the work sent jolts of fire up his wounded arm. He ignored it. When he finally carved a trench to the open air, the brightness was blinding. The world was a blank page, sculpted by the wind into waves and drifts. The sky so clear it hurt. He checked the shed. Bess and the mule were alive, restless and cold, but alive. He fed them, his movements economical, and then turned his mind to the second problem. Victoria had followed him out, wrapped in one of his blankets. She was staring at the spot where the carriage had been, now just a vague, dark mound under a mountain of snow. "We have to see," she said. It took them an hour of heavy digging to uncover the wreckage. The sight of it brought her fear back. She touched the splintered wood where she had sat, her face pale. The horse was gone, buried. The trunk was frozen solid. Luke examined the undercarriage, clearing the snow. "It's bad," he said, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Axles snapped clean. One wheel is nothing but kindling. "Can you fix it?" she asked, her voice tight. "Fix it? Maybe. But not fast. I'd have to forge a new axle brace, and I'd need to build a new wheel, or ride to Bozeman for one. But I must get to Bozeman. The Marshal, Morgan." "Victoria," he said, his voice flat. He pointed to the towering wall of white that blocked the valley pass. "Look, that's 10, maybe 15 feet of drift. Nothing is getting through that pass. Not a man, not a deer. The wires will be down. The town is cut off. You're not getting to the Marshal, and he ain't getting to you." Her shoulders slumped. "So we are still trapped?" "We're trapped," he agreed. "But at least we're alive, and we have food." He turned back to the wreckage. "I can salvage the other axle. Maybe get the trunk loose. But it's a day's work, maybe more. Right now, I need to scout the ridge, check on my cattle, see if anything else survived this. She argued, her desperation making her bold. The carriage is more important. No, he said, his voice final. Knowing who else is moving is more important. The wolves will be hungry. And men too. There's one way into this valley. I need to know if the storm buried it completely. He left her at the cabin, his rifle in its scabbard, his good hand on the reins. Bar the door. Don't come out. Be careful, Luke, she whispered, her hand on his knee as he sat in the saddle. He just nodded and nudged Bess into the deep, churning snow. The ride was slow, a brutal fight for every yard. The silence of the new world was absolute. He rode through drifts that came up to the horse's chest, following the creek bed, his eyes scanning, reading the snow. He saw the tracks of a lone coyote, the desperate, plunging trail of a snowshoe hare, and he saw his cattle, or what was left. He found 4 more, frozen solid in the coulee. The rest were gone, either buried or drifted south. It was a ruinous loss. A cold, hard anger settled in his gut. This land gave, and it took, and it always took more. He pushed on to the ridge that overlooked the valley entrance, the only path that wasn't a sheer cliff. He expected to see nothing but a smooth, unbroken blanket of white. He was wrong. He saw tracks. His blood went cold. He slid off Bess, keeping low, and crept to the edge, his body aching. Down in the pass, nearly a mile distant, a dark line of figures moved. Horses. 6 of them. They were moving slowly, fighting the same drifts he was, but they were coming. They were not wolves. They were men. He watched them for a long time, his mind racing. No one should be moving, no one sane. Not unless they were desperate. Not unless they were hunting. He needed to be sure. He mounted Bess and rode a wide, dangerous circle, staying in the deep shadows of the pines, until he was ahead of them, positioned on a high bluff that overlooked the trail. He waited. It took an hour. They appeared below him, dark shapes against the snow, their horses steaming, their curses faint on the cold. Still air. He watched them stop to rest their horses in a small, wind-blown clearing. One man dismounted, short and broad, and walked to the edge of the drift, pulling a flask from his coat. As he did, his saddlebag, heavy with gear, slipped. The man cursed and righted it, but not before a small object was torn loose, falling unnoticed into the snow. Luke waited until they had moved on, their voices fading. He waited 10 minutes more. Then he slid down the embankment, a controlled fall of snow and rock, and retrieved the object. It was a simple leather tag, meant to be tied to a saddlebag. It was stiff with cold, the leather dark, but the letters tooled into it were deep and clear. Morgan. The name from her nightmares. Langley. They took everything. Father's ranch. It all came together. A sharp, terrible clarity. The fine clothes, the ambush, the desperation to get to the marshal. This wasn't some random attack. This was a hunt, and the prey was in his cabin. He did not ride back. He raced. He pushed Bess harder than he should have, plunging through drifts, his face a grim mask, the cold wind tearing at his eyes. He saw the smoke from his chimney, a thin, vulnerable plume of gray against the blue sky, and it looked like a betrayal. A signal. He burst from the trees, sliding Bess to a halt, and fell from the saddle. He didn't bother tethering her. He stumbled to the door and pounded. "Victoria, open it!" She ripped the bar away, her face pale with fear. "Luke, what is it? Your arm!" "Get away from the window," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He slammed the door and dropped the heavy bar into place. The cabin was plunged into the dim, fire-lit gloom. "Luke, you are frightening me. What did you see?" He turned to face her, his chest heaving, his eyes hard. I asked you for your name. You told me Victoria. It is. What's the rest of it? He demanded. She shrank back. I don't know what you mean. He threw the wet leather tag onto the small table between them. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. I found this on the trail, he said, his voice cold. 6 riders. They'll be here by dark. They're coming for you. And I want to know who I'm dying for. She stared at the tag. Her hand went to her mouth, a small, choked sound escaping her. She looked at the name, Morgan, and all the strength she had built over the last 2 days crumbled. She sank onto the stool, her body folding. No, she whispered, tears welling, thick and hot. Oh, God, no, he found me. He found me. Who is he? Luke's voice was softer now, but no less urgent. She looked up, her eyes wide with a terror that was absolute. His name is Morgan, Silas Morgan. He was my father's foreman. Your father... My name, she whispered, the words torn from her. It is not just Victoria. My name is Victoria Langley. Luke felt the air leave his lungs. Langley? He had known it, in his gut. But hearing it spoken was different. The Langley Ranch. It was not a ranch. It was an empire. It controlled the water rights, the grazing, the beef contracts for half the territory. It was a place of power, of politics, of blood. And this woman, this half-frozen, delicate woman in his borrowed shirt, was its sole heir. My father, Arthur Langley, died 2 months ago, she said, the words tumbling out now, her composure gone. He left it all to me. The will was filed in Helena. Morgan, he said my father promised the ranch to him. He said a woman could not run it. He tried to make me sign papers, to turn it over to him. When I refused, I knew I was not safe. I hired Mr. Griggs and Silas, my father's only loyal guard left, to take me to Bozeman, to file the will with the territorial marshal. Morgan knew. He ambushed us. He killed them. He killed them both and left me for dead. She was sobbing now, her head in her hands. He wants the land, and he will kill me to get it. And now, he will kill you too. Luke stood very still, the pieces clicking into place. This was not a small-time fight. This was war, and it was on his doorstep. He looked at her, at this woman who represented a world of wealth and power he had spent his life avoiding. And he felt nothing, only a cold, hard resolve. The marshal isn't coming, he said quietly, repeating his words from the pass. The wires are down. The passes are closed. We're alone. Victoria. Then it's over, she wept. We have to run. We have to hide in the mountains. Run where? He said, moving past her. In this snow, we'd be dead by morning. We'd leave a trail a blind man could follow. There's one way in, one way out. They're on it. He took his rifle from the peg. We're not running. She looked up, her eyes blurred with tears. What do you mean? This cabin is solid oak. The logs are thick. 1 door, 1 window. It's a good spot to make a stand. A stand? She breathed, horrified. Luke, there are 6 of them. You are wounded. They are armed. So am I, he said. He laid the rifle on the table and pulled a heavy, older Springfield from under his cot. He checked its action. He also had his revolver. And so are you. He pushed the heavy Colt revolver he'd been given by Silas, his old friend, across the table to her. She stared at it as if it were a snake. I cannot... Do you know how to use it? He asked, his voice sharp. She nodded, her hands trembling. My father, he taught me to shoot at targets, not men. There's no difference, Luke said grimly. A target is a target. You point, you pull the trigger. You don't fire unless I tell you, or unless I'm down. Understand? She nodded again, her jaw tight. He moved with a grim, practiced energy. He took the heavy planks of his table, the one they had eaten on, and wedged it hard against the single window. "That won't stop a bullet, but it'll make them blind. They won't know where we are." He barred the door. He kicked the stool away, clearing the floor. What do I do?" she asked, her voice small. He pointed to his box of ammunition. "You load. Keep both rifles loaded. When I hand you one, you hand me the other." She picked up the box, her fine, blistered hands shaking. But she did not drop it. She knelt by the fire, her back to the wall, and began the slow, clumsy work of pushing heavy cartridges into the loading gates. She was trembling, but she was determined. The terror was a living thing in the room, but she was fighting it. They waited. The sun began to set. The light in the cabin faded from gray to a deep, cold purple. The only light came from the low embers of the fire. "Don't light the lamp," Luke said. He was positioned near the door, at a small, fist-sized loophole he had carved in the logs years ago. A Judas hole to see who was coming. He was so still, he barely seemed to breathe. The silence was agonizing. It stretched. He could hear her breathing, a little too fast. He could hear the click as she loaded a shell. Then, a sound. The crunch of snow, the jingle of a harness, horses blowing hard from the effort. Voices, rough, angry, and close. "This is it. This is Callahan's shack. I see the smoke." Victoria's breath hitched. She froze, a cartridge in her hand. "Quiet," Luke whispered. A new voice, louder, dripping with false confidence. "Morgan, Miss Langley, we know you're in there. We saw the wreckage. Just come on out. We just want to talk. Make this easy on yourself." Luke said nothing. He rested the barrel of his rifle in the loophole. "Callahan!" the voice yelled, anger creeping in. "This ain't your fight. You send out the woman, and we'll let you live. We might even give you a share. You got no part in this." Luke's voice was calm and low, but it carried in the still, frozen air. "She's not coming out?" A pause, then Morgan, his voice a snarl. "Then you'll die with her. You got 1 minute. Callahan." Luke looked at Victoria. Her face was a white patch in the gloom. "Stay low, away from the walls." "Burn him out, Morgan," another voice yelled. "Can't, fool. We need her alive to sign the papers." "Then we rush him." Luke waited. He heard the click-click of a rifle hammer being cocked. He saw a shadow move, detaching from the trees, heading for the cover of the shed. Luke fired. The crack of the rifle was a deafening explosion inside the small cabin. It was not a warning shot. It was aimed. The shadow in the snow stumbled, cried out, and fell. The world erupted. Gunfire tore the air, bullets thudding into the log walls like angry fists. One shot shattered the glass behind the table, sending splinters flying. Victoria screamed, pressing herself flat to the floor. "Stay down!" Luke yelled. He was calm. The chaos of Kansas rose in him, the cold, clear focus that only came in moments like this. He was breathing slow. He watched. "He got Jeb!" a voice screamed. "Spread out! He can't watch all sides! Tom, get the door!" Luke heard a man running, grunting with effort, trying to cross the open space to the cabin. He moved from the loophole to the heavy, barred door. He heard the man's heavy breathing right outside. He heard the thwack of an axe biting into the wood. "Victoria, the other rifle, watch the window!" He put his shoulder to the bar. He waited for the next axe fall. Thwack! He ripped the bar from the door, tore it open, and fired his revolver into the surprised face of the man on his doorstep. The man fell backward, a dark spray on the snow, his axe clattering. Luke slammed the door, dropping the bar back in place just as 2 more bullets ripped through the wood where he had been standing. "He got Tom. He's a demon. Morgan, he ain't worth it. He's killed 2 of us." There was shouting, panicked and furious. They had expected a frightened woman, maybe one wounded man. They had found a fortress. They had found a man who knew how to kill. "This ain't over, Langley!" Morgan's voice was hoarse with rage, but it was further away now. "You hear me? You're gonna freeze in there. You're gonna starve. We'll be back. This is my land." They heard the sound of horses, retreating in a panic, struggling through the deep snow. And then, silence. A silence more profound, more terrifying than the one that had followed the storm. It was the silence of death. Luke did not move from the loophole for a full 10 minutes. He just watched, waited. Are they gone?" Victoria's voice was a thin, shaking thread from the floor. "For now," he said. His voice was hoarse. She let out a long, shuddering breath that turned into a sob. She uncurled, her body shaking violently. The revolver had fallen from her hand, clattering onto the floorboards. She stared at Luke. He was in the dim firelight, automatically reloading his rifle. His movements were quick, economical, and practiced. His face was a mask of hard, cold stone. You killed them?" she whispered, her voice full of a horrified awe. He didn't look at her. "They came to kill you. But you did it. So easily." His hand stilled on the rifle. He finally turned and looked at her. The man she had seen tending his wounds, the man who had fought the wolves, was gone. This was a stranger. "It wasn't easy," he said, his voice low and ragged. "It's just familiar." He walked to the hearth and leaned against it, the rifle in his hand. "I told you I knew about running. Victoria, you run because you've done things like this before." He looked at the old, white scars on his hands. "I ain't no hero. I'm not some quiet rancher you stumbled on. I'm a man who's killed for money, and I'm a man who's killed for less. I came here to be left alone, to let the world forget me." He looked at her, his eyes full of a weary pain. "But it looks like the world found me." The confession hung in the air, more shocking to her than the gunfire. This was his past, the violence she had sensed, the reason for the scars, the hardness in his eyes. She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a savior, not as a captor, but as a man, as haunted as she was. And then she saw the blood. "Luke," she whispered, pushing herself up. "Your arm." In the fight, in the violent motion of barring the door and firing, he had torn the stitches. His left arm, the one the wolf had mauled, was soaked. A dark, steady drip was falling onto the wooden floor. "It's fine," he growled, but his face was pale, his body swaying slightly. "Sit down." Her voice was not a request. It was the same command she had used that morning. He looked at her, ready to argue, but the fight had taken the last of his strength. He sank onto the stool, the rifle sliding to the floor. She was there in an instant. She grabbed the rags, the whiskey, the needle. Her hands, which had trembled while loading the shells, were now perfectly steady. The shock had burned away, leaving a core of cold, hard steel. She cut away the ruined bandage. The wound was ripped open, bleeding freely. "This will hurt," she said, her voice flat. "Get on with it," he breathed, gritting his teeth. She poured the whiskey into the raw, open wound. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, his whole body going rigid, but he did not pull away. She cleaned it, her touch quick, no longer gentle, but efficient. She stitched him up for the second time, her movements sure, pulling the skin together with a grim determination. He was watching her face, inches from his. He could smell the smoke in her hair, see the small fleck of soot on her cheek. She was focused, her eyes on her work. She tied the last knot. Her hands, covered in his blood, rested on his arm. Neither of them moved. The silence in the cabin was a living thing. Outside, the world was frozen, dead. Inside, the fire crackled, and their breathing was loud in the small space. He moved his good hand. Slowly, he did not touch her hands. He lifted it to her face. She flinched, her eyes flying to his. His thumb, rough and calloused, brushed the soot from her cheek. His touch was so light, it was barely there. Her eyes fluttered shut. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime. He leaned in. She did not move. He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It was raw and hard and full of the gunpowder and the blood and the terror of the night. It was the frantic, hungry need of two people who had faced death and chosen life. It was a claiming. His mouth was hard on hers, and her bloody hands came up, gripping his shirt, holding on to him as if he were the only anchor in a world that had come apart. It was a long, breathless, starving moment. They broke apart, gasping, their foreheads resting against each other. They were both shaking. What they had done, what had passed between them, was as irrevocable as the killing. He was too weak to stand. She was too exhausted to move. He did not go to the cot. She did not go to the bedroll. He slumped, his back against the log wall near the door, his revolver in his lap. He would not sleep. After a long moment, Victoria slid down the wall to sit beside him. She did not touch him, but she was close, close enough for him to feel the warmth of her body. She was exhausted, her mind shattered, her body drained. Slowly, as the adrenaline faded, her head drooped. It came to rest on his good shoulder. He stiffened. He should move. He should push her away. This was madness. She was a Langley. He was what he was. But he didn't move. He was too tired, and her small weight against him was the only thing that felt real. He let his own head rest against hers. Outside, the moon rose, casting a cold, blue light on the two dead men in the snow. The world was frozen, silent, and brutal. Inside the cabin, by the dying embers, two survivors sat pressed together, bound by a shared secret, keeping watch against the dark. The gray, frozen light of dawn was a judgment. It crept into the cabin, illuminating the splintered wood of the window boards, the dark stains on the floor, and the two figures huddled by the cold hearth. They had not slept. They had sat in the suffocating silence, the ghosts of the night's violence and the ghost of their kiss pressing in on all sides. Outside, in the blue-white snow, lay two dark shapes, two men, frozen stiff, their accusations left unsaid. Luke was the first to move. He pushed himself up the log wall, his face a mask of gray exhaustion. Every line on his face was etched deep. The wolf bite on his left arm throbbed with a hot, sickening pulse, a sign that the wound was turning bad. His right arm, the good one, was stiff from holding his revolver all night. Victoria watched him. He was not the savior she had clung to. He was a killer. He was the man who had kissed her with a desperate, claiming force. And he was the only reason she was alive. "They'll be back," Luke said, his voice a low rasp. He did not look at her. He moved to the loophole, peering out at the still, empty valley. "Morgan's not the kind to give up. He's just gone for more men. He knows we're here. He knows we're trapped." "What do we do?" she whispered. Her body ached. "We can't stay." He turned, his gaze finally meeting hers. The hardness was back, but underneath it was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "This cabin, it's a trap now. They'll come back with numbers. They'll burn us out." "Run?" she asked, the old terror returning. "You said we could not run." "Not running. We're moving. To your ranch." Her head snapped up. "To the ranch? But that is where he is. That is his stronghold." "It's also the only other shelter in this valley," Luke said, his voice flat. "It's got food. It's got walls. It's the one place he'll expect us to avoid. And it's the one place you have a right to be. We stay here. We die. We run for the hills. We freeze. We go to the Langley Ranch. We have a chance. A small one." The logic was brutal and clear. She stood up, her legs shaking. "All right." They moved with a grim, hurried purpose. There was little to take. He packed the last of the salt pork, the cornmeal, and his remaining ammunition into a saddlebag. He gave her his spare wool shirt to pull on over her own, and his thickest mittens. She bandaged his arm again, her touch firm, impersonal. The skin around the stitches was an angry red, hot to the touch. They did not speak of the night before. The kiss was an unspoken thing between them, a dangerous ember buried under the ash of survival. He salvaged what he could from the wrecked carriage, her trunk, which he lashed to the mule. He buried the two bodies in a deep snowdrift, a grim, silent task. He worked with his one good arm, his jaw tight against the pain. He did not say a prayer. He just covered them, erasing the evidence of the fight. He put her on his horse, Bess, and mounted behind her. "Hold on," he ordered, his voice gruff. She did. She slid her arms around his waist, her hands clasped tight against his stomach. She was pressed against his back, her cheek against the rough wool of his coat. She could feel the solid warmth of him, the slow, steady beat of his heart under her hands, and the rigid tension in his muscles. She was placing her life, completely and utterly, in the hands of a man who had confessed to being a killer. She closed her eyes and held on. The journey was a white hell. They did not take the main trail. Luke cut up into the high, broken country, a path that was harder, colder, but hidden. They moved through a world of profound, silent beauty. The mountains rose around them like jagged white teeth, the sky a piercing, cloudless blue. The snow was so deep, the horse struggled, plunging to her chest, her breath coming in great, pained clouds. The mule followed, stubborn and slow. The wind was a constant, slicing force, finding every gap in their clothing. It carried fine, glittering dust of ice that stung their faces raw. They stopped only when the horse could go no further, resting in the lee of great, snow-covered boulders. They ate the frozen salt pork, chewing it slowly, their rations already thin. Victoria had never known such cold. It was a living thing, a predator that seeped into her bones, but a strange, fragile peace settled over her, tucked behind Luke, sheltered by his body, her arms locked around him. She felt a sense of belonging she had not felt since her father died. He was her only wall against the wind. She trusted his silence. She trusted the set of his shoulders, the way he read the snow, the way his body moved with the horse. He was a violent man. He was a haunted man, but he was, she knew, a decent one. This trust was a seed, fragile and dangerous, growing in the frozen landscape. On the second day, they descended into a valley cut by a river. It was frozen solid, a wide, flat ribbon of pale green ice. Luke stopped the horse on the bank, sliding from the saddle. He moved stiffly, his wounded arm held tight against his side. The fever from the wolf bite was setting in. She could feel the heat of it, even through his coat. He walked to the river's edge, breaking ice to let the horse drink from the frigid water below. Victoria dismounted, her own legs stiff and weak. She stood beside him, watching the black, fast-moving water under the ice. "I used to know this place," Luke said, his voice quiet, almost to himself. He was staring across the river, at the high plateau on the other side. "You've been here before?" He nodded, his face unreadable. "A long time ago, 10 years. I worked a season on one of the big ranches. Over that way." He gestured with his chin. Victoria's breath caught. "Which ranch?" He was silent for a long moment. "The Langley Ranch." She stared at him, the wind whipping her hair across her face. You worked for my father?" "For a season," he said, his gaze distant, lost in memory. "I was young, drifting. I was good with horses, and I was good with a gun, so they hired me on." "Why did you leave?" she whispered. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were full of the same shadows she'd seen the night before. "I told you, I ran. I left a lot of places." He picked up a piece of broken ice, weighing it in his good hand. "There was a dispute, a violent one. A man died. It was my fault. I've been running from it ever since." He threw the ice. It skittered across the frozen river, a lonely sound in the vast silence. Victoria looked at his profile, at the guilt etched there. She saw a man haunted by one terrible mistake. She did not feel fear. She felt a strange, aching pull. Fate. It felt like fate. The land had brought him here, all those years ago, and then it had sent him away. Now, when she needed him most, it had brought him back. He had not just stumbled upon her. He had been sent. "We should go," he said, the moment broken. "It's not far now. We'll be in your territory by nightfall." They reached the outskirts of the Langley estate as the sun was bleeding into the western hills, painting the snow in shades of orange and blood. The ranch was bigger than a town, nestled in a wide, high valley, sheltered from the worst of the winds. The main house, a sprawling two-story log and stone structure, sat on a rise, overlooking a dozen barns, sheds, and bunkhouses. But it was wrong. "It's so quiet," Victoria whispered from behind him. There was no smoke from the bunkhouse chimney, no cattle lowing in the feed pens. The corrals were empty. It looked half-abandoned, a ghost of the bustling, powerful place she remembered. "They're here," Luke said, his voice low. He pointed. A single thread of smoke rose from the main house, and he could see tracks, horses shod and recent, leading to the largest barn. "Morgan's holed up in your father's house." He slid off the horse, helping her down. "We can't ride in, they'll have pickets." He led the horses into a thick stand of aspens, their white bark blending with the snow. About 100 yards from the main buildings was a small, low structure he recognized, a hunter's shed or a line cabin, used for emergencies. He cleared the snow from the door and pushed it open. It was dark, cold, and smelled of dust and old skins. "You wait here. Don't move. Don't make a sound. I'm going to get a look." "Luke, no, your arm. You have a fever." She touched his forehead, and his skin was burning. "I'm better in the dark than they are in the light," he said. "I used to know this place. I know its shadows." He handed her the older Springfield rifle. "Bar the door. Use this if you have to." He vanished into the blue twilight, a ghost moving between the snowdrifts. Victoria was left alone. The silence of the shed was absolute. She barred the door and sat in the dark, the heavy rifle across her knees. She was on her own land, but she was a prisoner. She thought of her father, of this house. She thought of Luke, out there, wounded, facing the men who wanted her dead. Luke moved like water in the dark. He skirted the main house, using the empty barns for cover. The fever was a hot, dull buzzing in his head, but the cold air kept him sharp. He found a position behind a water trough, overlooking the lighted windows of the main parlor. He could hear them inside. Voices, rough and loud, laughter. They were drinking her father's whiskey. He crept closer, beneath the window, pressing his back to the cold stone foundation. The window was open a crack, letting out the heat and the voices. "I got the judge and Bozeman in my pocket," Morgan's voice boomed. He sounded drunk and victorious. "Soon as the pass is clear, I file the new will, Arthur Langley, leaving the ranch to his loyal foreman, Silas Morgan, for services rendered." "What about the girl?" another voice asked. "The girl," Morgan laughed. "The girl died in a tragic carriage accident in the storm. We found the wreckage ourselves. A terrible shame." "And if she turns up, what about that gunman, Callahan? He killed Jeb and Tom?" "Callahan's one man, wounded. Maybe. And the girl is soft. If they ain't frozen in a ditch already, we'll find them. We'll find them. And we'll finish it. Now, pour me another." Luke's blood ran cold. Forged documents. They were going to steal everything, her name, her land, her very life, and erase her. He had to get back to her. He had to tell her. He was backing away when he heard the faint crunch of a boot in the snow behind him. He turned, his hand on his revolver. But he was too late. It was Victoria. Her face was white as the snow, her eyes wide and burning with a reckless fury. She had the heavy rifle in her hands. "Victoria, no!" he hissed, grabbing for her. "Get back to the shed. What are you doing?" "He's in my father's house," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "He's drinking my father's whiskey. He's trying to erase me. I won't hide. Not anymore." Before he could stop her, she broke from his grip and ran toward the front porch, toward the light. "Morgan!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the night. "Get out of my house!" The voices inside stopped. A chair scraped. "Luke, run!" she cried back at him, stumbling up the steps. It was a trap. He knew it, but he couldn't leave her. He ran after her, drawing his revolver, just as the front door was thrown open. A man stood silhouetted in the light, a rifle in his hand. "It's the girl!" Victoria tried to lift the heavy Springfield, but she was too slow. The man leveled his rifle. Luke fired first. The shot was deafening. The man on the porch grabbed his chest and fell. Luke shoved Victoria through the doorway, into the parlor, into the light, into the heart of the enemy. The room exploded. It was chaos. 2 men were at the table, scrambling for their guns, and Silas Morgan, a big man with a thick black beard and cold, dead eyes, stood by the fireplace, a revolver already in his hand. "Callahan!" he roared, his face a mask of shock and rage. Luke shoved Victoria behind him, firing his revolver twice. One of the men at the table fell, the other dived for cover. "Victoria, run! Get out!" Luke yelled. Morgan fired. The bullet hit Luke high in the left shoulder, the same side as the wolf bite. The impact spun him around, a new, searing fire erupting in his body. He stumbled, his vision blurring. "Luke!" Victoria screamed. "Well, well," Morgan sneered, advancing, his gun steady. He recognized Luke. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Luke Callahan. I thought that name sounded familiar. Still killing foremen. Are you?" Luke was on his knees, his revolver empty, his left arm completely useless, a waterfall of new, bright blood mixing with the old, dark stain from the bite. What are you talking about?" Victoria breathed, her back against the wall. "This your new man, girl?" Morgan laughed, his gun trained on Luke's head. "You got poor taste in hired guns. This one, he already worked for me." Victoria's gaze snapped to Luke. "Worked for you?" "Oh, yes." Morgan savored the moment. 10 years ago, till he got in a fight, till he put a bullet in your father's real foreman, a good man named Abe Selby. Killed him dead. Your daddy trusted Abe with everything. And this gutter trash shot him in the back." Victoria's world fell apart. She stared at Luke, the man she had kissed, the man she had trusted, the man whose confession by the river had been a lie. He hadn't just been in a dispute. He had killed her father's trusted man, the man Morgan had replaced. Her heart, which had just started to trust, was broken. You killed him?" she whispered, her voice dead. Luke looked at her, his face pale with blood loss and a deeper agony. "Victoria, it wasn't like that." "Liar!" Morgan yelled. "I was there. I saw it. He's a back shooter. Girl. Always was." Morgan raised his pistol, aiming for Luke's head. "Now, I'll finish what Abe started." In that second, Victoria moved. She did not know if she was saving the man she loved or the man she hated. She just acted. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and threw it, screaming with all her strength. It hit Morgan in the arm. His shot went wild, shattering a mirror on the wall. Luke, using the last of his strength, lunged forward and tackled Morgan, his good shoulder hitting the big man's knees. They both went down in a crash of bodies. The last man at the table, seeing his chance, ran for the back door and fled into the night. "Get the gun! Luke!" Victoria screamed. But Luke was fading. The blood loss was too much. Morgan was bigger, stronger. He threw Luke off and scrambled for his revolver. "Victoria, run!" Luke gasped from the floor. "Run!" She did not run. She grabbed Luke by the collar of his coat, her small body straining, and dragged him. She dragged him out the front door, off the porch, and into the blessed cold darkness. Bullets chased them, whipping through the snow as Morgan fired from the doorway, cursing into the night. She did not stop. She hauled Luke's dead weight through the snow, toward the trees, toward the horses. He was moaning, half conscious. "No, leave me, Victoria, go." "Shut up," she sobbed, pulling him, her feet sinking deep, her lungs burning. "You do not get to die, not now." She got him to the aspens. She, who had never saddled a horse, somehow got him onto Bess's back, slumping him forward over the saddle. She untied the mule and climbed up behind him, her arms once again locking around his waist, this time to hold his bleeding, unconscious body in place. She rode. She did not know where. She just rode up, into the hills, into the frozen, moonlit wilderness, away from the ranch, away from the gunfire, away from the terrible, devastating truth. They hid. She found a deep hollow, a scar in the earth between three great pines, sheltered from the wind. She pulled him from the horse. He was in a bad way. The bullet wound in his shoulder was bleeding terribly, but it was the wolf bite that scared her. It was swollen, black, and the skin around it was hot with infection. His breathing was shallow. He was burning with fever. She had no fire, no blankets, only her own body. She tore strips from her own petticoat, packing the bullet wound, trying to stop the bleeding. She sat in the snow, pulling him against her, cradling his head in her lap, wrapping her own coat and the saddle blanket around him. She held him, rocking him, the tears freezing on her cheeks. Her heart was broken. He had lied to her. He had killed a man loyal to her father. He was part of the darkness that had haunted her family, even before Morgan. And yet, she held him. She brushed the wet hair from his forehead. His face, in the moonlight, was pale and younger, the hard lines softened by pain. He had saved her. He had killed for her. He had kissed her. And she loved him. The realization was as sharp and as painful as the cold. He murmured, lost in fever. "Kansas, Silas, wasn't not my fault. Abe drew first." She bent closer, listening to the broken fragments. He shivered, a violent bone-rattling tremor. He was dying. The cold and the fever were taking him. She held him tighter, pressing her cheek to his, trying to force her own life, her own warmth, into him. "You cannot die," she whispered, her voice fierce, a vow to the uncaring, frozen stars. "Do you hear me, Luke Callahan? You cannot leave me. If you die, the land means nothing. The ranch, the name, it is all just snow. It means nothing. You are the only thing that's real. Stay, please, stay." He did not answer. He just shivered, his breathing a faint, shallow whisper. She held him through the long, dark, frozen night. She did not sleep. She did not weep. She just held him, her heart a cold, hard knot of love and betrayal, and willed him to live. As the first, faint, gray light of dawn touched the high peaks, his shivers began to ease. His breathing, while still shallow, grew more regular. The fever had not broken, but he had held on. He had survived the night. Victoria looked down at his face, pale and scarred, and a new resolve hardened within her. Her heart was broken. Yes, but it was not beaten. She looked toward the valley, toward the ranch that was hers. Morgan had lied. Luke had lied. The world was built on lies and violence, but the land was hers, and the man in her arms was hers too. She would not be a fugitive. She would not hide in the hills and wait for death. She would go back. She gently laid Luke's head on the saddlebag. He stirred, his eyes opening a fraction. They were clouded with fever, but he saw her. "Victoria," he whispered. She touched his lips. "Rest. We are going home." She stood up, her small figure silhouetted against the growing light. "We are going back, at dawn, not as fugitives. We are going back to reclaim what is ours." The dawn broke like a fever, cold and thin. A heavy fog clung to the snow, smothering the world in a silent, gray wool. They rode through it, a single, slow-moving shape of misery. Luke was a dead weight, slumped forward against the saddle horn, barely conscious. Victoria sat behind him, her arms locked around his waist, her own body aching with a cold that had burrowed into her bones. She was no longer just holding on. She was holding him up. His life was in her hands, a heavy, fragile thing. Every lurch of the horse. Bess sent a low groan through him. The fever from the wolf bite was raging, a consuming fire that his body was losing against. The bullet wound in his left shoulder was a dark, frozen stain on his coat. She had done her best to stop the bleeding in the dark, frozen hills, but she knew it was not enough. She looked at the man who had lied to her, the man who had, 10 years ago, killed her father's foreman, Abe Selby, the man who, she now understood, had been replaced by the snake, Morgan. She tried to feel the betrayal again, the sharp, cold anger, but it was gone, burned away by the long, terrible night. All she felt was the agonizing, hot reality of his life seeping away between her frozen fingers. He had killed for her. Twice. He had lied about his past, yes, but he had told the truth with his actions. They reached the edge of the aspen grove, the same one that had hidden them the night before. Below, in the hollow, the Langley ranch house sat silent. The single plume of smoke still rose from the chimney. They were awake. They were waiting. Luke stirred, his head lifting a fraction. His eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. "Go," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Take the horse. Ride east. Don't stop." "We are not running," she said. Her voice was flat, hard as the frozen earth. "Victoria, I can't, my arm, I can't fight." He tried to lift his right hand, his good hand, to the revolver at his hip. It shook violently, a palsy of fever and weakness. He could not even unlatch the holster. She saw the shame in his eyes, the agony of a strong man made helpless. "I know," she said. She unwrapped her arms from his waist. She slid from the horse's back, her legs numb, landing hard in the snow. She walked to his side and looked up at him. Her small, frost-bitten hand moved to his holster. His eyes widened. She did not hesitate. She unhooked the leather flap. Her movements sure. She drew the heavy Colt revolver, its grip worn smooth, its barrel dark and cold. "Luke," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying in the still, fog-shrouded morning. "You saved me from the snow. I tended your wound. You fought the wolves. I stitched you again. You killed for me. I dragged you to the hills. We are even." She checked the cylinder. Loaded. She met his gaze. The woman he had pulled from the snowdrift was gone. In her place was a queen, pale and terrible, with eyes as cold as the frost. "It's my turn to fight." She turned from him and did not look back. She walked out of the trees, into the open, her boots crunching in the crust of the snow. She walked, one slow step at a time, toward the main house, toward her home. The men inside heard her. The front door opened a crack. She kept walking. She did not run. She did not hide. She walked as if she owned the ground under her feet, which she did. The door opened fully. Silas Morgan stood there, a rifle in his hand. He had not slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, his black beard matted. He stared, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. He had hunted her, shot at her, left her for dead. And here she was, walking toward him, alone, a revolver held loosely at her side. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. The two other men, the ones who had fled, emerged behind Morgan, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. They, too, were armed. You're dead," one of them stammered. "I am not," Victoria said, her voice clear in the cold air. The fog swirled around her feet. Morgan recovered, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. He leaned his rifle against the doorframe, a gesture of absolute, mocking confidence. "So the ghost came back. And where's your gunman, girl? Did he finally bleed out in a snowbank? Did you come back to beg?" Victoria did not look at him. She looked past him, into the dark hallway of her home. "I am Victoria Elizabeth Langley," she said, her voice ringing out, a formal declaration to the mountains, to the land itself. "I am the daughter of Arthur Langley. This is my house, and this is my land, by law and by blood. You are trespassing." She raised her eyes to his. "I am here for my father's ledger, the book that proves my title. You will give it to me, and you will leave my property. Now." There was a moment of absolute silence. The two men behind Morgan looked at each other, their bravado gone. She sounded like her father. Morgan burst out laughing. It was a harsh, ugly sound that shattered the morning. "By law?" he boomed. "I am the law here. Your father's dead. Your gunman is dead. You are nothing. You're a soft, East Coast girl in a torn dress, holding a gun you don't have the stomach to use. You are nothing without a man to protect you." He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out. "Now, you give me that gun, girl, before you hurt yourself. We'll go inside. You'll sign the papers I drew up, and maybe I'll let you live. As a cook, perhaps." "He's not dead." The voice came from the fog. It was a rasp, barely human, but it was full of iron. Morgan froze. His head snapped toward the trees. Luke Callahan was walking out of the mist. He was a nightmare. His coat was a frozen, bloody ruin. His left arm was strapped to his chest, his right arm hanging limp, shattered at the shoulder from last night's bullet. His face was the color of ash, his eyes burning with a feverish light. He was unarmed, his holster empty. He was dying on his feet, but he was coming. He gripped the porch railing with his bleeding, useless right hand to hold himself upright. And she is not alone. The standoff was broken. Morgan's confidence shattered. This was not a ghost he could mock. This was the man who had killed 3 of his crew. Morgan saw it all in an instant. The girl with the gun, and the devil who refused to die. He made his choice. He yanked his own revolver from his belt and fired. Not at Victoria, but at Luke. He aimed for the heart, the killing shot he had failed to make last night. Luke, too weak to stand, was already falling. The bullet, aimed for his chest, tore through his right shoulder, the good shoulder, splintering the bone. A strangled cry of agony was ripped from him. He collapsed onto the steps, his good arm destroyed, the knife he'd been holding clattering uselessly onto the snow. He was completely helpless. Morgan smiled, a wolf's smile, and turned his gun, leveling it at Luke's head. "I told you, Callahan, I always finish the job." Time stopped. Victoria saw it all. Luke bleeding out on her steps. Morgan, victorious, his finger tightening on the trigger. She remembered her father's voice. Years ago, on a sunny afternoon. "Do not pull, daughter. Squeeze. Squeeze it slow. And do not aim. Just look where you want it to go." She raised the heavy revolver with both hands. Her arms did not shake. She looked at the center of Silas Morgan's chest. She fired. The sound was a flat, deafening crack that echoed off the frozen hills. The recoil punched her backward a step, nearly tearing the gun from her grip. Morgan's smile froze. He looked down at his chest, at the sudden, spreading dark spot on his shirt. He looked up at Victoria, his eyes wide with a profound, idiotic surprise. He tried to speak. A gout of red blood spilled from his lips. He fell forward, crashing down the steps, and lay still in the snow, his eyes open, staring at the gray sky. Silence. A ringing in Victoria's ears. The smell of sulfur and gunpowder, sharp and acrid in the cold air. The two men on the porch stared at her. They looked at Morgan, dead in the snow. They looked at Luke, bleeding on the steps. And they looked at the small, pale woman in the torn dress, the smoking revolver still held in her two hands. She was not nothing. She was the one left standing. One of the men dropped his rifle as if it were on fire. We didn't want no part of this. Miss, it was Morgan. It was all him. The other man was already gone, running for the barn, for a horse, for his life. The first man scrambled after him, falling in the snow, desperate to escape. Victoria did not watch them go. She let the heavy revolver fall from her numb fingers. It dropped silently into the snow. She stumbled forward, her legs giving way. "Luke!" She fell to her knees beside him on the steps. He was conscious, his body twisted, his breathing shallow. Blood was everywhere. From the left, from the right. He was a ruin of torn flesh and shattered bone. He looked at her. His eyes, clouded with pain, were clear of fever. He saw her. She didn't cry. She had no tears left. She lunged forward, grabbing the front of his bloody coat, and pulled his head into her lap. She bent over him, her body shielding him from the world, her hair falling around his face. He looked up at her, at the fierce, protective angle of her jaw, at the smudge of gunpowder on her cheek. "Told you," he whispered, his voice broken. It was your turn." She just held him, her face buried in his hair, her body shaking in the aftermath of the violence. He was alive. She could feel the faint, ragged breath against her neck. He was alive. In the cold, ruined parlor, among the shattered glass and the overturned furniture, she tended to him. She had dragged him inside, away from the body of Morgan, and laid him on the long sofa, her father's sofa. She found whiskey and clean linens from her mother's chest. She worked for an hour, her hands steady. She cut away the ruined coat. She saw the 2 fresh bullet wounds, one in each shoulder, raw and bleeding. She saw the wolf bite, black and angry with infection. He was a map of all the violence they had endured. She cleaned him. She bandaged him. She forced whiskey between his lips, for the pain, and then for the infection. He was lost in a haze of pain, but his eyes never left her. She finished, her hands stained with his blood. She sat on the floor, her back against the sofa, her head resting near his arm. The house was utterly silent, save for their breathing. She looked around the room. Her father's desk was stained. His favorite chair was overturned. The air was thick with the smell of death. "It does not matter," she whispered. To him, to herself. "None of it? The ranch, the ledger. I do not care about it. It is just land. It is not worth this." She looked at his pale, still face. "It is not worth you." He stirred. His hand, the left one, the one that was only bitten and not shot, moved. His fingers, weak and clumsy, found her hair. He gripped it. "You have to," he rasped, his voice a thread, but fierce. "You have to care." She looked at him. This is your land. Victoria, your name." His eyes burned into hers. "Your father's name. It deserves that. We did not come this far for nothing. You hold on to it." He was not just talking about the ranch. He was talking about her, about who she was. She took his hand, her small, blistered fingers lacing with his. She held it against her cheek. She did not need to say the words. He did not need to hear them. He had seen her walk into the gunfire for him. She had seen him rise from the dead for her. In the ruined house, surrounded by blood and shattered glass. They had confessed everything. The sun was high when she finally stood. The fog had burned off. The light, streaming through the broken window, illuminated the task ahead. She could not leave them there. She found a shovel in the shed. She went back inside. Luke was asleep, or unconscious, his breathing shallow. She went outside. She put her hands on the body of Silas Morgan. She tried to move him. He was a heavy, large man. She could not. A voice behind her. "Together!" Luke was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his face the color of old snow. He was wrapped in a blanket, his arms bound to his chest. He was upright, but only just. He stumbled down the steps. Together, they took hold of the body. She, with her arms, and he, with his shoulders and his weight. They dragged Morgan away from the house. They took him to the frozen earth behind the barns. They did the same for the man on the porch, and the one in the parlor. The ground was frozen iron. They could not dig. They worked for NS hour, using the shovel, using broken boards, to move rocks and heavy snow. They did not make a grave. They made a cairn, a tomb of rock and ice, under the high, cold, unforgiving Montana sky. They finished as the frozen dawn turned to a pale, cold day. They stood side by side, leaning against each other. She was filthy, covered in soot and blood. He was broken, barely standing. They were bound, not by words, not by vows. They were bound by the shared loss, the grim justice, and the cold, hard ground they had just consecrated. The land was quiet. The air was clean. It was, finally, theirs. Weeks later, the world began to breathe again. The thaw came not as a gentle release, but as a violent, groaning breakup. The silence of the deep winter was shattered by the crack of river ice and the roar of meltwater. The snow, which had seemed eternal, pulled back like a dirty sheet, revealing the bones of the land beneath, black mud, skeletons of animals caught in the drifts, and the first pale, determined shoots of green. The Langley ranch house was scarred, but it stood. Inside, the great parlor had been scrubbed clean of blood, but the mirror was still shattered, and the bullet holes in the logs remained, dark, round reminders. Victoria had refused to have them filled. They were part of the house now, part of its story. Luke Callahan's healing was as slow and as stubborn as the spring. The fever from the wolf bite had nearly taken him. For 10 days, Victoria had not left his side, forcing broth and whiskey down his throat, bathing his burning skin with snowmelt, fighting the infection with a desperate, silent ferocity. He had lived, but the cost was high. His body was a roadmap of the winter. The wolf bite on his left forearm was a puckered, purple ruin. The bullet that had torn through his right shoulder, the one Morgan had fired, had shattered the bone. It had set crookedly, tended only by a woman with no medical training, only a desperate will. He would never again have the full use of that arm. The hand that had been so fast, so deadly, could now barely hold a cup of coffee. His left arm, the one Morgan had shot the night of the rescue, was better, but the muscles were scarred and tight. He was a gunman who could no longer draw, a rancher who could not rope or lift a heavy saddle. He was a changed man, and he did not know what was left. As the passes cleared, the world returned. The first to arrive was a territorial marshal from Bozeman, a hard, weary man named Eli Thorne. Leading a posse, he had come investigating the rumors of Morgan's takeover and the silence from the Langley ranch. He found Victoria on the porch, her hands stained with ink from her father's ledger. He found Luke, pale and thin, sitting in a chair in the sun, his arms in slings, his empty holster hanging on a peg inside. And he found the fresh, frozen cairn of rocks behind the barn. "Miss Langley," the marshal had said, his hat in his hands, his eyes taking in the bullet holes in the porch rail. "It seems you've had trouble." Victoria told him everything. Her voice was quiet, steady. and cold. She did not weep. She did not embellish. She told him of the ambush, the first killings at Luke's cabin, and the final fight in her parlor. She showed him the forged will she had found in Morgan's coat pocket, the one leaving the ranch to him. Marshal Thorne listened, his gaze shifting from her calm, pale face to the broken man in the chair. He knew Luke Callahan by reputation, a ghost, a man who'd killed a foreman in Kansas and vanished north. "And you, Callahan?" Thorne asked, his voice hard. "This was a lot of shooting for a man living quiet." Luke met his gaze. "It was Marshal." "Luke saved my life. Marshal, twice," Victoria said, her voice cutting in, sharp as ice. "And I saved his. Every man buried in that pile came here to kill me for my land. It was justice. It was not murder." The marshal looked at her, at the steel in her spine. He looked at the forged will, and at the 2 dead men in Luke's cabin he'd found on the way. He grunted, a low, unhappy sound. This was a land where justice was often just the person who was left to tell the story. "The territory will find that Silas Morgan and his associates died resisting a lawful claim," he said finally, putting his hat on. "The Langley Ranch is yours, Miss, by law." He nodded to her, then to Luke. "I'd get that arm looked at. Callahan, a man needs his strength." With the law settled, life began to return. The news spread down the valleys. Old man Langley's daughter, the one they thought was dead, was alive. She had killed Morgan and taken the ranch back. The old hands, the ones loyal to her father who had been run off by Morgan, began to drift back. They came in 1s and 2s. An old cook named Jebediah, a grizzled foreman named Silas Brown, who had been her father's right hand before Abe Selby, and a half-dozen young, tough cowboys. They came to see this woman who had survived the blizzard and a gunfight. They found her not in the parlor, but in the barns, in the corrals, in the ledger book. She was thin and pale and quiet, but when she spoke, her father's voice was in her words. She promised fair wages, a full winter's pay for their lost time and hard work. "My father built this place," she told them, her small figure standing on the porch. The men gathered below. "Morgan nearly ruined it. We will build it back. We will make it a place that is fair, a place that is safe." The ranch, which had been silent and dead, came alive. The sounds of hammers rang out, mending fences and patching bullet holes in the barn. The forge roared, shaping new iron. Cattle, bought on her father's credit in Bozeman, began to fill the pastures. The land, which had been a white prison, was now a green promise, and Victoria was its heart. She worked from sunup to sundown, her delicate hands becoming calloused, her mind sharp. She was transforming the ranch and herself with a quiet, unyielding strength. And through it all, Luke watched. He helped where he could. He could no longer ride with the men. He could no longer break the new horses. But he could think. He sat on the porch, his body mending, and he advised her. He knew cattle. He knew the land. He knew the men. He became her shadow, her quiet counsel. The men respected him. They had seen his scars. They had heard the story. They gave him a wide berth, but they listened when he spoke. He and Victoria lived in the big house together, but as if separated by a canyon. They were bound by the violence, the shared blood, and the unspoken kiss, but that world had frozen and died. This new world, the world of spring, of ledgers and paychecks and normalcy, was a world in which he did not fit. He would watch her at night, her head bent over the ledger books at her father's desk, the lamplight on her dark hair. She was an heiress, a lady, the richest woman in the territory. And he was the man who had killed Abe Selby. He was the gunman who could no longer shoot. He was a piece of the winter, a dark, scarred thing that did not belong in her bright spring. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the new green hills in shades of gold and rose, he made his decision. He had his strength back, What was left of it? He could ride. He owed her his life. But he would not saddle her with his presence. He would not be her shame, the living reminder of the violence it took to win her land. She found him in the barn. The air was sweet with the smell of hay and leather. He was standing by Bess, his one good hand slowly, awkwardly trying to tighten the cinch on his saddle. His saddlebag, the one he'd had at his cabin, was packed and lying on the ground. She stopped in the doorway, her shadow falling long in the golden light. He stilled, his hand on the strap. "You are leaving," she said. It was not a question. He did not turn to face her. He kept his gaze on the horse. The arm's as good as it will get. I can ride." "Where will you go?" Her voice was quiet, without judgment, and it cut him deeper than a knife. "North, Oregon, maybe. I hear they need men." "We need men here. Luke," she said, taking a step into the barn. "You need cowboys," he said, his voice rough. He finally turned to look at her. "You need foremen, men who can build. You don't need what I am." "And what are you?" He looked down at his hands, his right hand, curled and stiff, his left, scarred by the wolf. "I'm the man who killed your father's foreman, Abe Selby. Morgan, he didn't lie about that. I killed him." "You told me it was a dispute," she said, her voice still quiet. "It was," he said, the old guilt rising in him like bile. "He was a bully, quick with his fists. We argued. He accused me of something I did not do. He went for his gun. I was faster. It was a fair draw, in a saloon full of witnesses. But I killed him. Your father's man. I took him from this ranch. I left a shadow here long before I met you." He looked at her, his eyes full of a weary pain. "I brought you nothing but blood. Victoria, Morgan, the fight at the cabin, the fight here. I am the part of your story that needs to be over. You're safe now. You have your land. You don't need a ghost hanging around." He turned back to the saddle, fumbling with the strap, a final, clumsy gesture of dismissal. She was silent for a long time. He could hear the horse breathing, the swallows nesting in the rafters. He heard her step closer. He felt her presence right behind him, the warmth of her. "You are right," she said softly. He flinched, the words hitting him like a physical blow. He closed his eyes. "You are right about Abe Selby," she continued. "He was my father's foreman, and my father trusted him. But my father was not a perfect man. He trusted Abe, and he trusted Morgan, who replaced him. He did not see the rot that had set in. He was tired at the end." She moved to stand beside him. She looked at his bound-up, useless right hand. "You say you brought me blood," she whispered. "You are wrong. You brought me life. You pulled me from the snow. You fought for me when I was too weak to fight. You showed me that I could fight for myself." She reached out. Her hand, no longer soft, but calloused and strong, did not touch his. Instead, she gently took his ruined right hand, the one that had been shattered, the one that was a symbol of his failure, his new weakness. He tried to pull it away, his shame a hot, burning thing. "Victoria, don't!" She held on. She lifted his hand, his scarred, stiff, broken hand, and she pressed it flat against her own chest, high on her collarbone, just over her heart. He froze. He could feel it, the steady, slow, powerful beat of her heart, thrumming against his palm. It was the sound of life, the sound of her. "I needed saving once," she said, her voice so soft he had to lean in to hear it. "Back in the snow, I was cold, and I was lost, and you were my anchor." She looked up, her clear, deep eyes meeting his. "Now it is your turn to be home." He stared at her, the words not making sense. "Home? Victoria, I'm broken. I am not the man I was." "Good," she whispered, a faint smile touching her lips. "I did not like that man. He was always running. She pressed his hand more firmly against her. This man stayed. This man came back. This man is home. He let out a breath, a ragged, shuddering sound he felt he had been holding for 10 years. He did not pull his hand away. He let it rest there, feeling the steady beat of her heart, an anchor in the storm of his past. He stayed. They rebuilt the ranch. They rebuilt their lives. They were two haunted souls, two survivors, finding a strange, quiet peace in each other's presence. The nightmares did not vanish all at once. Some nights, he would wake in a cold sweat, the smell of gunpowder in his nose, and she would be there, a steady presence in the dark, her hand finding his. Some nights, she would wake, screaming, feeling the cold of the snow, and he would be the one to hold her, his scarred, clumsy arms a fortress. They never forgot the cold. They never forgot the snow or the blood. It was the iron that had forged them. The final scene came months later. It was not a grand day, just an afternoon in late summer. The hills cured to a deep, rich gold. The land was alive. The ranch was thriving. They were riding, side by side, checking the cattle in the high pastures. He was on Bess. She was on a spirited mare her father had loved. Luke sat his saddle well, but his right arm was strapped, as it often was, to ease the ache. His left hand held the reins. He was a changed man, but he was here. He glanced over at her. The wind was in her hair, and the sun had brought a faint color to her cheeks. She was no longer the pale, spectral woman from the blizzard. She was strong. She was real. She caught his gaze and she smiled. A small, quiet smile that was just for him. He reined in his horse, just looking at her. The woman he had pulled from a snowdrift. The woman who had killed for him. The woman who had given him a home. He whispered, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer fought. Didn't know I was saving the richest woman in the territory. Victoria's smile touched her eyes. She rode her horse closer, until their knees were touching. She looked at him. The gunman, the ghost, her partner. You didn't, she answered, her voice soft as the wind. You just saved me. He reached out his left hand, the one scarred by the wolf. She met it with her own. They sat there for a long moment, hands clasped, two silhouettes against the vast, golden land. Two survivors of the winter, bound by a love that was stronger than the cold, and fiercer than the world's cruelty. Thank you for listening to this story from Wild West. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. And be sure to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts.